Welcome to session 5 of our course on corporate strategy. I hope you are all doing well and staying safe out there. If there's anything I can do to help, let me know. Our topic for session 5 is internal development, and that is what we'll be talking about. Before I dive more deeply into internal development as a mode for corporate growth, I want to introduce the second module of the course. If you'll remember, over the first module of the course, we focused on various rationales for corporate strategy in terms of creating various types of synergies and whether or not those synergies were best managed within a single firm or across multiple firms working together. We also discussed horizontal diversification and vertical integration, and how those are defining characteristics of a corporate strategy. In the second module of the course, we focus on various modes of executing corporate strategy. Specifically, in terms of growth, we'll be talking about internal development, the topic for today. And over our next couple of sessions, we'll be talking about alliances and joint ventures, mergers and acquisitions, as well as divestitures, which include multiple ways of reducing the scope of the corporation. So let's get started on our topic of internal development. Before I go into the specific frameworks that we'll be talking about, I want to distinguish the Puranam and Vanneste perspective on corporate strategy from the perspective of Capron and Mitchell. With the Puranam and Vanneste perspective, you first start by identifying the desired synergies. We will use the 4C framework primarily for that, but as we also discussed, you can also consider the resources you have and the opportunity cost of applying those resources in new domains. And you can also think about things like demand-side synergies. Once you've identified the synergies that you hope to create, the next step is to determine whether those synergies are best managed within one firm or between multiple firms working together. That decision is based on governance costs, or alternatively stated, the relative cost of transaction costs versus ownership costs. Certain synergies are best managed within a single firm, particularly those that are one-sided in nature or require high resource modification, while other synergies, such as those that are two-sided or have lower modification requirements, can easily be managed or more cost-effectively be managed between firms. Once you've made a decision on this governance structure, and in particular, whether those synergies should be managed within a firm, the firm faces the choice of how to create the resources necessary for those synergies. And it has two options for that, assuming that they're taking an ownership approach to these synergies. One option is to develop those resources internally, and the other option is to acquire those resources externally through something like mergers and acquisitions. In making that decision, we'll be considering several key trade-offs between these two options. The Capron and Mitchell perspective is a little bit different, and you're totally welcome to use either of these approaches in your final projects. The Capron and Mitchell perspective starts with strategy formulation. That is not strictly defined within their framework, but you can think about that as identifying the corporate strategy of the firm, and more specifically, the types of synergies that you're hoping to create with various resources. Although it's not part of their approach, the 4C synergy framework works well here for thinking about the strategy formulation. The next step in that process, and the first step of the resource pathways framework, is identifying strategic resource gaps, those resources that are required to execute your strategy that you don't already have. And once you've identified the strategic resource gap, you walk through the resource pathways framework in the order of the steps specified to help you identify the best pathway for obtaining those resources. Alternatively, if none of those pathways is viable, you can also go back and redefine your strategy and start this decision process over again. So this is the framework for analyzing key trade-offs in accessing resources. In this perspective, you've already considered the synergies you're hoping to create and determined that those synergies are best managed within a firm. If you are managing these synergies within a firm and you need resources, you need to figure out how to best obtain those. There are different options for this. There's organic growth or internal development, as we're mostly referring to it in this course, or there's inorganic growth or mergers and acquisitions to obtain the resources you need to bring in-house to create your synergies. And each of these have various trade-offs. In order to create inorganic growth, to acquire resources through mergers or acquisitions, those resources need to be available externally. If they are not available, then acquiring them is not even an option. So external availability is necessary if you want to use mergers or acquisitions to capture those resources. Alternatively, if you can identify the resources you need, you can think about how to create those internally, which is more the focus for today's discussion. Several questions come up in determining how easy that could be and the challenges that may stand in the way of internal development. Specifically, if you're thinking about imitating the resource base of competitors, you need to determine how easy it would be to copy that resource base, and also how easy it would be to catch up to the level necessary to compete. If you are not imitating the resource base, you can also think about substitute resources that can be used to obtain, to achieve the same goal without the need of fully imitating some resource. First, thinking about that external availability. Again, this is pretty straightforward. Are there firms out there that have the resources you need? And even if there are, you can also think more carefully about that availability. If that external resource is owned by a competitor and you have no prospect of merging with that competitor, you may not be able to acquire the resource externally. Similarly, if the company that owns those resources is very large, too large for you to acquire, or if it contains many other businesses that you do not want to acquire, external availability will be limited. If the partners are available with those resources and there's the possibility of you acquiring them, that would favor inorganic growth or growth through acquisitions. The next issue is the ease of copying resources. So even if a resource is available externally, you may choose to create that resource internally. And there are various barriers that could stand in the way of that. In terms of ease of copying resources, one of the first questions to consider is legal hurdles or barriers to imitation. If there's intellectual property in particular that's protecting the resource, that may make it very difficult for you to recreate a comparable resource. There may be other legal barriers as well. Perhaps there's licensing restrictions or government regulation that prevents new entry or acquisition of certain resources. So again, as you think about copying resources and developing them internally, you need to ask whether or not that's legal and can be accomplished in a legal way. The second barrier to acquiring resources externally is the absence of tacit knowledge, or rather, tacit knowledge acts as a barrier to copying. Tacit knowledge is know-how. It's the type of knowledge that exists in the minds of workers that cannot be easily documented. Often that comes from experience working with in certain industries, certain technologies, certain types of customers, perhaps operating in certain competitive environments. These are all things that companies and people get better at over time, and developing certain resources may require tacit knowledge that you do not have. So if that's the case, that would be a barrier to copying. The final barrier to copying is causal ambiguity. Even if you are able to define some of that knowledge that you're hoping to acquire, maybe you can hire the people that have it, it still may not work for replicating that resource internally. There are many resources that are generated through very complex processes over time, which can make them difficult to replicate. One example of that could be corporate culture. Culture is developed over time through many repeated personal interactions and various choices that are made and policies that are created. And that makes it something very difficult to replicate. Many companies will try to replicate things like culture. They may identify high-performing cultures like Facebook or Google and see that they have beer kegs or ping pong tables or other markers of culture. And they think that by copying these markers of a company culture, they can replicate the culture. But in fact, it's much more difficult than that. The next barrier to imitation is the ability to catch up to the competitors or the resource base required to accomplish your goal. Even if the resources can be clearly defined and the process for creating them is clear, it may take too long to go about creating the resource from scratch. There are various things that can make very time-consuming to create a resource. The first barrier to catching up to the competition would be if you lack the resources necessary to create the new resource. There are a lot of resources that are related to each other, specifically in terms of one resource being necessary or helpful for creating another. One example of that could be creating a sales team. There are various things that would make it easier for you to develop a sales team, even if you've never had that before. If you have brand recognition or a reputation for a quality product, then when you start hiring salespeople, they can call up potential customers and will have a much easier time getting their attention and the opportunity to try to sell to them based on this brand or reputation. If you don't have that brand or reputation, you can try hiring a lot of sales reps, but it will be much, much more difficult for them to succeed. Another barrier to catching up to the competition in terms of creating resource bases is positive feedback loops. Often positive feedback loops are seen as a positive thing from the perspective of incumbents. If you already have a resource and you're trying to grow it, that can often be much easier than creating it from scratch. One example of a positive feedback loop is direct network effects. So some products are more valuable when there are many other customers also using that product. Social networks are one example of that, but also office productivity software. If you're using Google Docs to write things and you want to work with your team, it's a lot easier if they all use Google Docs as well. If they're all using Microsoft Office, it may be easier for you to adopt and use that instead. Another example of positive feedback loops often comes in hiring. So some companies have a strong reputation for hiring the best people, using them well, sometimes for specific functions, and then those employees go on to have great careers either within the company or elsewhere. An example of that is Procter and Gamble with marketing. It's long been considered one of the best consumer marketing companies in the country. If you are a marketing graduate and you're very highly skilled, you may be drawn to working with the best marketers out there, and that would draw you to Procter and Gamble. And they would also have an easier time hiring you based on that reputation. If you're starting or working with some other company that does not have that reputation, it would be much, much more difficult to acquire the best marketing talent without paying them substantially more to attract them. And again, this is a positive feedback loop. So as Procter & Gamble continues to attract the best marketers, those marketers will continue to go on and have great careers elsewhere once they are done at Procter & Gamble. And that continues to reinforce that reputation. You also see similar effects at companies like Google, which across the board is known for hiring great people. And many of those employees go on to do great things elsewhere, which makes it much easier for Google to attract talent relative to less reputable or less well-known employers. The final thing that can make it difficult to catch up is time compression diseconomies. If time compression diseconomies exist, that essentially means that creating a resource is much easier and less costly if you spread a certain amount of investment over time rather than trying to invest all of that at a single point in time. To give an example of this, there are a lot of very well-known brands that are very familiar to many customers, and that has come from marketing that has been done over many years or sometimes even multiple generations. If a new company wanted to recreate that same level of brand recognition overnight, it could require substantially more investment and effort, or perhaps ingenuity, to try to achieve the same level of brand awareness in a short amount of time. The final option for creating resources internally, if you are unable to copy and catch up to the competition in terms of imitating an existing resource, you can choose to find a substitute resource instead. So if you can't copy and catch up, you may choose something else that can achieve the same objective without the equivalent barriers. Very often when you see an industry being disrupted by new entrants, it's because entrants have found some substitute resource that can be obtained much more cheaply than whatever resource was protecting the industry from entry previously. One example of that, very hard to create mechanism or resource can be trust. Many companies build up trust over time through consistent service and quality. Others rely on things like government regulation and licensing to ensure that firms in an industry perform at a certain level of quality. Companies like Uber and Airbnb have entered the lodging and transportation industries by identifying a substitute way of creating trust with customers. Specifically, they created or leveraged rating mechanisms where customers can rate the providers, and that allows Uber to filter out bad drivers or Airbnb to filter out bad hosts over time. And customers develop trust in both of these services, believing that the previous rating will ensure some minimum level of quality for the services being offered. Shifting now to internal development. Internal development, or not shifting to internal development, but shifting to a new perspective on internal development. This is the resource pathways framework. Again, the key first step in applying this framework is identifying a strategic resource gap, and that gap is based on the strategy that's been developed. Once you have identified the strategic resource gap, you are choosing the best way to fill that gap or to gain access to that resource. The first option in this framework is internal development. Laurence Capron and Will Mitchell ask two types of questions for each pathway, a knowledge question and a governance question. The question, if you are doing internal development, is whether your internal resources are relevant. So the knowledge question there is the knowledge fit. One area of confusion here, many people think that this knowledge fit means that the firm already has the knowledge necessary for the new business. If that were the case, it would not be a strategic resource gap. They would just have fungible knowledge that can be applied to a new domain. Instead, what this knowledge fit question is about is whether the firm has the knowledge necessary to create the resources internally. So it could be that that new resource is new knowledge, and then the question is whether or not they have the right R&D talent with the right backgrounds to develop something new. Resources could also be something like a brand or a reputation. And then the question is whether you have the right managers or marketers in place to create the desired brand or reputation. So resources can take many different forms, but the question for firms considering internal development is whether they have the knowledge necessary to build the resource that they're hoping to obtain. In addition to having the right knowledge, organizational fit is also important. Again, this may not mean having the exact organization you need for creating this new resource and deploying it, but it does mean that you don't want to have organizational misfits with this new strategy or new resource approach. One example of that could be a company that's very good at business-to-business sales. There are a lot of things that are necessary for that. A lot of the product development is more focused on IT departments or purchasing at the corporate level to figure out what makes a product valuable to a business client. That would be different if you're trying to sell a product, even if it's very similar to consumers. Similarly, the sales process is very different. If you're selling to businesses, you may have sales teams that go out and visit potential customers and spend a lot of time explaining the product and the value of the product and trying to close deals in that way. If you're selling to consumers, for most products, you can't have a salesperson spending a lot of one-on-one time with every potential customer. Instead, you need to make your product more self-explanatory. You need to be good at marketing the features and value of the product and making instructions on how to use it very clear. So if you have an organization that is really good at one of those things, it often means that they've created processes and routines and cultures that would support continuing to act in that way, but new business models or approaches may create misfits or conflicts within the organization. So that is two different frameworks for thinking about internal development versus alternatives. We also read a paper for the topic of internal development on complementarity and innovation strategy. So it's long been known in the strategy literature that internal knowledge allows the absorption of external knowledge. So you need some level of understanding in order to be able to acquire knowledge from the outside, to understand what others are doing, or to evaluate and acquire knowledge. And you need to be doing some of your own internal knowledge creation to generate that. This leads to absorptive capacity. There's been less focus previously on the importance of that external knowledge for continuing to grow internal knowledge. So some types of products cannot be fully developed internally without an ongoing stream of information about cutting edge technology or the latest in basic sciences or things like that. So having access to that external knowledge is also necessary to continue internal development. What the authors of this paper want to know is when complementarity between this internal knowledge and external knowledge acquisition matters most. So it's not necessarily a question of whether internal knowledge and external knowledge are complementary, but rather when they are most necessary for creating value with each other. So complementarity of these activities essentially just means that the incremental profit of adding one to the other is greater than the incremental profit of doing that activity over doing nothing. Another way of thinking about that is your internal development efforts are more productive if you also have external development efforts, if this complementarity exists. Similarly, your external development efforts may be more successful when you have internal development efforts as well, again, if this complementarity exists. So the question here is not just whether it exists, but how the importance of that complementarity depends on the context. In just a brief note on how the authors go about looking for this complementarity, they specifically try to find other things that are complementary with one of these modes of growth and not the other. For example, if regulation around mergers and acquisitions is relaxed or antitrust enforcement is reduced, that would encourage more acquisitions to take place. If that same external change also leads to more internal development or more research and development, that would indicate a complementarity where the change in the environment is not only increasing mergers and acquisitions, but because that increase in mergers and acquisitions increases the productivity of internal development, that increases as well. So the finding of these authors is that this complementarity is highest in industries that rely on basic science. So firms that are doing composite material engineering or creating new pharmaceuticals, for example, often rely on external knowledge, perhaps from university labs or independent researchers. They're also constantly looking at what the competition is doing and trying to stay on the cutting edge of materials or pharmaceuticals. So those firms that are most dependent on the external knowledge also need to do a lot of internal development in order to maximize their ability to understand what's going on externally. And similarly, bringing in that cutting edge information and that cutting edge science is necessary for the continued success of their internal development efforts. You can also imagine this complementarity being important in other environments. For example, a lot of technology ecosystems have a lot of very interdependent products that need to work together in order to create value. So if you have a high level of interdependence, that may be a situation where complementarity between internal development and external sources of knowledge and information and resources is very important. The next paper considered exploration and exploitation being balanced across various modes of corporate strategy. Exploration and exploitation are concepts that have been around in strategy for quite a while. It's important for firms to explore, which means going out and looking for new technologies or new opportunities or new product categories where they might be able to be successful. But it's also important for firms to exploit those technologies or opportunities once they're discovered. So that means often making continual refinements, incremental improvements to the offering to increase its appeal to the market and to basically capture value from all those investments made in discovering the opportunity or technology in the first place. It's very important for businesses to do both of those. If they spend all of their efforts looking for new things, but never actually take advantage of those new opportunities, that is not really a recipe for success. Exploring is expensive and you need to recoup that investment in some way. On the other side, a firm that only focuses on exploiting what they already have and making incremental refinements and improvements to that technology could miss out on potentially valuable opportunities out there. And in addition to missing out on valuable opportunities, they may risk failure over time if their own area of expertise is disrupted by something else that's out there. The authors of this paper and many papers in strategy have identified inherent conflicts between exploration and exploitation. That is because firms develop various routines and policies and cultures that are more supportive of one or the other. For example, if you have an R&D team that's always working on continual improvements to your technology and small changes to make things better with every iteration, they may get very good at finding those small opportunities for improvement, but miss the out-of-the-box creative thinking to identify really big opportunities for entirely new product categories. Alternatively, if that R&D department is always focused on the innovation and has a culture of exploration and exploring and supporting ideas that haven't been fully tested yet, that culture may not be as supportive or effective for continuing to find incremental improvements as well. Because these often cause conflict, strategy scholars have come up with various approaches to solve this problem. One of the first solutions to this problem was called ambidexterity, and that is when you have two different business units, perhaps one focused more on a legacy technology and another business unit focused on newer technologies. The logic of having those separate business units is that one can be really good at exploitation and the other can be really good at exploration. There are some problems with this though. First, it is expensive to have two separate business units, especially when there are overlaps between their technologies and market opportunities and things like that. In particular, having greater separation between these makes it more difficult to create synergies between them. Another solution that's often proposed is sometimes doing exploration and sometimes doing exploitation. This is called temporal separation. This is often caused by probabilistic search. So a firm will continue to exploit its existing opportunities and technologies, making ongoing improvements until the market creates some sort of problem for them. Perhaps customers are going elsewhere or the technology is running out of room for improvement. And at that time, the company would start looking for more radical alternatives for growth. The problem with this approach is that good opportunities don't just come along when you're looking for them, if you're only sometimes looking for them. So while your company is in exploitation mode, you may miss out on a lot of very valuable opportunities. Similarly, while you're looking for radical new opportunities, you may have parts of your business that could still continue to benefit from a lot of incremental and ongoing improvement. And you may be missing out on that if you are more focused on doing something entirely different. Another approach to solving this exploration and exploitation problem, or the problem of balancing them, is to do different exploration and exploitation in different parts of the value chain. So for example, your product team could be trying to find a lot of new products and new opportunities, or developing new technologies and considering the value of those, while your manufacturing part of the value chain could be focused on continuous improvement and incremental gains to efficiency and productivity. Just as with the other approaches, there are downsides to this. For example, sometimes new technologies come along to dramatically change how production is done and may allow for more radical productivity improvements. And if your manufacturing part of the value chain is just focused on exploitation, those can be missed. Similarly, if your product side is focused on always exploring and finding new products, you could miss out on potentially valuable exploitation opportunities at that part of the value chain. The authors of this paper propose an alternative approach. So rather than balancing across business units, so having a business unit exploring and another exploiting, or balancing across time, sometimes doing one and sometimes doing the other, or balancing them in different parts of the value chain, The authors of this paper argue that these exploration and exploitation can be balanced across different modes of corporate strategy. So specifically, you could use your internal development for exploitation, finding those constant improvements and tweaks and product line extensions to make the most of the opportunities you have, while alliances or acquisitions could be used for more exploratory activities to bring in big new products or ideas, or to gain access to external knowledge about what's going on. The reason for this separation across modes is that these modes are also likely to lead to some sort of specialization over time. I think I mentioned earlier, your internal development could be more focused on the exploration or the exploitation. When they're doing one or the other, there's going to be a lot of choices made in terms of the type of people that are hired, the policies that are put in place for rewarding short-term versus long-term improvements. All of these things will create path dependence, and the organization will get better and better at one or the other type of activity. So the alternative here is that you can continue to have that specialization there, and then you can use these other modes for whichever you're not specializing in. So they argue for some intentionality here. Knowing that you are going to end up with that, you want to be sure that across internal development, alliances, and acquisitions, you're using at least one of those for exploration and one of those for exploitation. One thing that they sort of overlook is that alliances and acquisitions are two different modes for external access to resources. So my personal opinion is that alliances can be used for either exploration or exploitation, and acquisitions can be used for the other. Your actual needs in that may depend on what the company has done previously or what type of technology you're working with. But you can have both exploration and exploitation using external knowledge and external resources. And then internal development can be used for either one or the other. So I think that's everything I have on internal development. I'm sure many of you came up with questions as you were watching this. I would strongly encourage you to ask those questions on Canvas, discuss them with your peers. You can also ask me in class next time we meet, and I can try to answer your questions there. And again, I hope you are staying safe and have a great day.